This is the Charleston JS React meetup, and we've got a presentation today on React Query. Scott Sandman will be doing the presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion, or if anyone has any kind of lightning talks they want to share, that would be great too. But yeah, so I'll go ahead and pass the torch over to Scott and let him get started. Thanks for coming.
Okay, everybody got my screen okay?
Yep.
Yep,
April
good.
Fools.
Okay. So back when I talked to Tom about presenting, I asked him for a few topics. One of the topics he brought up was React Query. I was vaguely familiar with it at the time. I had come across it while I was looking at Suspense. Essentially, I was looking for ways to clean up some of my front-end code and how I was handling state. And I came across React Query, and when Tom mentioned it, I dove in to see what it was about, especially the statement you see here, the separation of client and server state. React Query is the Tanner Lindsley's he firmly believes in extracting server state out of global state and the separation of the two. And after having used React Query for a little bit, I am beginning to wholeheartedly agree with that. So just a brief introduction about what React Query does. It's gonna enable you to fetch, cache, and update your data in your React and your React Native applications, all without touching any what we would refer to as global state. It's going to reduce the amount of code you have to write. There's no more need to write actions, reducers, context, or anything like that. It handles the caching, background updates, and stale data right out of the box. It's passing a function basically, which fetches or data or throws an error if it can't retrieve that data. And it comes pre-configured, but it is also very highly configurable. Just a few of the features. It's back-end agnostic, really doesn't care where your API is coming from. It has auto refetching, parallel queries, which we'll get into a little bit today, automatic garbage collection, scroll recovery, which is something that had been kind of waning in recent years due to a lot of things, a lot of front-side frameworks like React, and React Query gives that back to you right out of the box. You don't have to do anything for it. Render as you fetch, offline support, dedicated dev tools, which is very nice. We'll get into that, and I'll show you a little bit of that too. Window focus refetching, which is nice. Dependent queries, paginated cursor queries, which I will also show you a little bit of today. Request cancellation, prefetching. I'm sure you guys have read the list already by now. There's a lot of cool things on here, and pretty much everything you're seeing on the screen is coming out of the box. It's ready to go from word one. A few, and these are Tanner's words, important, aggressive, but sane defaults. So out of the box, the hooks use query and use infinite query, consider cache data stale immediately. It is changing it real quick, and I will show you how we can modify that and set it to what we want it to be if something other than an immediate stale. Inactive queries are garbage collected after 5 minutes. Again, this is going on in the background. If you don't want to change that, it's already set up for you. Failed queries are silently retried 3 times with an exponential back-off delay. That is also customizable. You can change that into a linear delay. You can change the exponential delay if you want, or you can just simply put in a straight delay. And then according to Tanner's data, results are structurally shared to see if data has changed. If not, data reference remains unchanged. According to Tanner, 99.9% of the time, you will never have to worry about that last statement. So we're going to roll with, we don't have to worry about this last statement today. So from there, we'll get into a little bit of the code. So as you can see up front, there's not a whole lot that needs to be going on. So I've already preloaded React Query. It's pretty lean, runs about the same as Apollo and similar frameworks like that. Up front, we're going to import a query client and a query client provider. So for that query client, we're just going to start a new query client, get that going. I'll touch on these default options here in a little bit. And then we're just going to wrap our app as high as possible with our client provider and then pass it in our query client. So the first one I wanted to touch on today is we're just going to take a look at a general use case for React Query. So you can see that we pulled up a few, what these are is television shows. I did a search for April. Not exactly sure where that last one came from, but we'll just roll with it. So as we get a look into the code, again, this is all the code that was necessary in order to generate those TV shows right there. So we import the hook use query from React Query, and then I also imported Axios. You can also use Fetch, whatever you all like to use there. And then went into my component. From there, I extracted 4 returns from the use query hook. Just to let you know, there are 20 returns that can be extracted from use query alone, just this single hook. As far as options go for the use query, there are 24 of those. So there's a lot of configurability, a lot of stuff that you can handle on your own if you choose to do so and don't want to use the out-of-the-box settings. So is loading is working straight up front. So as the data is being fetched, is loading will be true. And so if you have a loader or whatever, you'll be able to see that. I don't think that we can see it here. I think the data is loading a little fast. Yeah, it's just kind of blipping up there right now, but I'll change some things in a little bit so we can take a deeper look into that. If we are to get an error, it'll stop there. And then when it's updating, doing a background update, I just throw this in just to show and demonstrate it, but the updates that are going on in the background, if you didn't have this, you probably wouldn't even know that they were happening. And then simply map over the data that comes in and extracted out the show names. And that's where we were able to get, these 3 show names right here. Pretty straightforward stuff right out of the box. As we got into the use query hook, the first thing that we have here is a query key. These become very important as you're moving along. Query keys are how your data is identified in the cache. So we'll get a little bit deeper into those as we get into some other examples. But just know that you will always have a query key. And then from there, we're just passing it. We can pass it a function, or in this particular case, I was just passing it the fetch that I was looking for. The next one I wanted to show you is you can actually use a default query. So if we come up here, I've written a default function. Okay, so again, I'm using Axios, and this default query function, I'm passing in the query key. When the query strings are passed, are handled in the background, they are transitioned into arrays. So as you can see here, I have query 0 on, so I'm just pulling that string out of the array in order to append it to the URL, and then taking the data out of there. So now I've set up this default query function. On the main page, I've gone into the query client, and for the query function and the default options, I've told it that I want to use the default query function, which I've imported up here. So now in the default query component, I've brought in use query and use query client. So we had passed the client down through the provider. So all I have to do is set the query client, use the query client here. And now all I need to pass into my use query, because of the default query function, is the key. So from that key, I'm going to be able to get the data out that I am looking for. And so now you can see that we have a whole list of shows here. I believe it goes about 240 deep. So the benefit of using something like the default query, in my mind, is if you have an app that's similar to this, where your front-end user is just getting a lot of data, and you have the same URL basically, except for a few API changes on the back, you can simplify your code greatly by writing that default function and then passing in just your keys, which look like the end of your URL, and there you have your API, and it becomes that streamlined, that intuitive to get all your data back to the front side. Moving on from there, React Query has their own independent dev tool set up. I'm just gonna uncomment those. Right now, this is also highly customizable. When I show it to you, I'll tell you about some of the things that you can change. Right now, I've set initial is open to be false, so it will be closed when I open it up. But React Query dev tools can also be inserted into your application while you're in development as a component itself. So where it's actually moving around inside as you're scrolling. Not sure who wants to use that, but it is available to you. When we get this opened up, taking a look at dev tools here, you can see the query key that I passed in, and then you can see where the data came in. And then in the Query Explorer, we have, our default options, cache time, and some other, things that are going on behind the scenes. But you can also notice that the data is already marked as stale. I will dig into that a little bit more, but as soon as it's refreshing, it's automatically being noted as stale. Let's see here. So as we move along, the next one I want to show you that I think has some pretty good benefits to it. Some of this turned off. Is the preferred method for handling these are using hooks. So I've written a few hooks here. I have a search hook and a show by ID hook here. That are coming through this hooks and cache. So there's a little bit more going on in this one than we had in the other ones. I did, for the first time, have to use some state from React. This is merely to handle client state. It has nothing to do with our global state. I'm gonna download or use the query client again. And then I've brought in 2 hooks here that we've written. So here's some of the local state stuff I'm doing. That's just for how we're going to be viewing the data. So right now we just have the search showing. So if we take and do our search, we're going to get some shows returned to us. So what we have going on down here in the shows, this is initially rendering. So that's what you just saw come up from the search. I use the query client. I'll get to that more in just a minute. And then I've extracted the same returns that we did before. And now I'm just using my hook and passing it my search from my local state. Same stuff here as before. And then I simply just need to map over what's the data that came through. So what I did is I set up that data and to be linked to the episodes for that show. So if we go to one of those, we can see what episodes are available for that particular show. Now, by pressing the back button, you'll notice that the link that I clicked is now changed. So I used red to make it a little more obvious, but well, I've used that query client to go and take a look in the cache and told it that I want to look at the key show. And I want to specifically look at the ID of the specific link that I just clicked. And if that has been saved in the cache, I want to change it to color red. So it's giving you some really deep finite control over how you want to handle your client side state as well as your server side state as far as visually. It really digs deep and can't even get into the number of returns and options that are available in that stuff. There's a lot pretty similar to the use query one. So very similar. As we take a look at the hook here and we get the show by ID, get the show from the first one is the search hook. Okay, so basically we have our async data call here where we're getting the data and then we're exporting a default function as a hook and we're returning the use query hook where we're passing it in a key of search and the search. So if we go back and take a look at our data down here, you can see that I have the key of search and I have the data for which it was looking for. Below that, which is now showing as inactive, was the original show and the ID number for that show. So the other hook, so I just took the ID from the show, passed it back down into this next hook, which is a use show query to use the ID in order to pull up the episodes for those shows. Again, you can see very intuitive code, not a lot of code at all to make that happen. Everything behind the scenes is basically doing right by us at this point. There isn't a whole lot that we have to add or do to get the data that we need or to handle it. Next one I want to take a look. Apologies, is dynamic parallel queries. So React hook in and of its, hooks in React in and of itself, you could take a lot of these different hooks and you can manually just put them side by side and call them and get the data that you need. And that would be fine. But if you need that to be dynamic, or you have a different number of calls each time, that is against the laws of hooks. That's not something that is going to be allowed. However, Mr. Lindsley has made it possible. So as we take a look into the dynamic parallel queries, you can see, again, we're using a use queries now hook instead of a use query. I didn't use a hook for the function. We basically just have a function call up here to fetch the shows. And then I threw together just a few IDs for some television shows. And now if you'll see right here on show queries, we get into use queries, and I'm mapping over these IDs in order to make the calls in parallel. So I'm passing an ID and then the show ID, and then the query function I want it to use, which is also being passed the show ID. And whenever you're using a variable with the React query, if you pass in a variable, you should pass it into your key as well, if you need it in your function. That's kind of the rule of thumb. That's how everything, again, is identified in the cache for you. And then from there, I just needed to map over the data in order to get it to show you some stuff. And if we just take a look at that, and there are the 3 shows. I've had a Canadian sense of humor lately, so I've been watching some Canadian humor. But, and then you can also see down here where our data has been rendered or stale, not inactive, but stale right away, immediately. But I think that's the parallel queries, I think, have a lot of, some application, not a lot of application, but some application. This down here, I'm not going to implement this. This is actually code that I have live right now for a project that I'm working on. I just wanted you to show you a different way that use queries can actually be handled. So just using an object platform and directly passing in a query key, and then the function I want it to execute. So use queries will go through and execute each one of these in parallel. And then the data that I get back out will be an array, and those queries will be in order of that array. So if I want driver survey results, I'm looking for data 0, index 0. If I'm looking for fetch subscriptions, I'm looking for data index 6. I didn't actually use that a lot in the application. I found that I lost some functionality with it. And in reading through some of the discussions and documents and with regards to React Query, it seems to be the better approach is to write the hook and just call the hook where you need it. As opposed to this, it does work. We're able to get the data that we're looking for without any issues, but we lose a little bit of the ability to see some of the actual stuff that's going beyond the scenes, because each one of them is being handled individually. So we're not getting a lot of the usage that we would if we were doing them through just a single use query. So the next one I wanted to take a look at is pagination. So again, it's not taking us a whole lot of code in order to accomplish this. I do have a local state that I'm using to keep track of our page number. And then I'm also bringing in query client again. I will show you what I'm using that for here in just a moment. So same thing, we're extracting data. I'm extracting one more piece of data with this particular one. Okay. So we can just take a look at when our data was last updated. So here you can see that at 5/28/31, our data was updated. So if we go into next, you can see that we're paging along. We have page 0 and page 1. So we take a look at page 0. Page 0 has now been declared inactive. So the inactive will stay in the cache and won't be garbage collected for 5 minutes based on default settings. If we take a look at page 1, we're immediately stale. So in a lot of applications, this probably isn't ideal depending on your user case and how much you need data. But in a situation like this, if I was to leave and go here and then come back, it's refetching automatically on window focus. And so that call is being made back to the server again. So we have some data transfer that might not necessarily be something that we want right there. So that's one of the reasons why. So if we take a look at the page hooks here, we have some options that we're able to do. So I'm just going to use a stale time of 6 seconds on this. And then if we go back, you can see that the data is now staying fresh. And then it goes stale. So if I go back to the previous, you can see where I have fresh data there, inactive data here, as we're not on that page. We go back to page 1, page 2, you can see how the data is staying fresh. Page 1 is now inactive. So I think that's a great feature to have in order to take care of some of the default activity that's going on, especially if you don't need to be fetching that often. Another one that we can take a look at, so the refetch on window focus. If that's something that you don't need for your particular app, if it's okay that your app doesn't refresh, so you can see it'll go stale. So if I leave now and come back to it, it remains stale now. It's not making that call again. And it'll remain stale until it's told to refetch, either based on the cache going, using up its time limit, or you make some sort of call that refetches that data for you. Another one of the many options on the backside that we have available is on success. So if you're doing something and you want to do something immediately on the success of receiving your data, you can pass it through right there on options, and it'll go ahead and take care of it right there for you. I think, again, that's a really neat feature to have. We also can do the same thing with on air. So if we, oops, I did not save that. There we go. So if we take a look, it's going to try to load. It's doing its refetch 3 times. And then on air, it's telling me that, oops, we had a mistake. And now it's go ahead and it's going to the component where it's saying, there was an error passing through the message. We have a network error. And then we can change the retry times and number of times it's retrying and knock it down. And you can see that that didn't take quite as long. You can also change retry to infinite, and it'll just keep going and going and going until you get your data. But this is also, in this retry, would be where you can set your exponential delay or your linear delay. Can all be done right in here, or you can just simply set it to true, and it'll also keep retrying over and over again until it has success. So you can see there, it's still in the fetching state. I don't believe, yeah, I didn't. And you can see we have our data again. It's remaining fresh. React Query also comes with mutations. I haven't taken a dive into the mutations yet. There's a lot going on the query side of it, and been spending a lot of time in there, making sure that I have a pretty good understanding of that. At this point, I am pretty much a fan. I was a little bit skeptical coming in. I'd been one of those that every time I got a new toy, I was like, oh, yeah. And then I would run into problems and be like, oh, this isn't what I want. So I was a little more skeptical coming into React Query, and have been really pleasantly surprised at how much it's allowed me to clean up the front end code and how easy it is for me to go fetch the data off of my APIs.
Awesome.
And that is basically what I have for you all today.
Great job, Scott.
Thank you, sir.
Notice there's one question in the chat from Robert. The scroll to, was that Windows scroll to or Element scroll to in the, I guess it was in the beginning when you were showing all the features?
So I think I was just talking about the features. I think we were in hooks and cache.
Does anyone else have any questions for Scott?
I have a question actually for anyone. Actually, I'm curious. There's kind of a similar hook library out called SWR, and I'm curious if anyone has used both and has thoughts on one versus the other.
I personally haven't used SWR. I've looked at the comparison of the two. There's not much difference except for in a few key areas where it seems to be a little bit cleaner on React Query side in order to get things done, from what I can tell. But honestly, I haven't used SWR and I haven't really looked into it that deeply.
Gotcha.
Cool. And then, is Vercel supporting SWR?
Yeah, they support that header, but the hooks themselves, it seems like it's kind of set up around the same problem, not just that query or not just that that caching header, but also just fetching, revalidation, and caching by key kind of thing.
Cool.
Yeah, there's another one that's very similar that is working through Redux. I'm trying to remember, it's RQK or RWK, something like that.
RTK, Redux
RTK.
Kit, yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess Redux is dead, right?
If you have an application that has a lot of client state that you have to control, I think that it's, for me, it would still be viable. But as far as, mentally now having the separation of client and server state, I'm pretty sold that just from, my perspective, it just cleans things up enough for me that, I liked React before a lot, and I've used it pretty much exclusively through the past year or so. And I had some frustrations as of late with, not clean code and things getting a little jumbled on me, and running across this is just, I like React a lot more now with this. It's it's kind of a tool that's just reinforcing to me that, you know, I want to stick with React and, you know, keep moving down this path, you know, until something else, you know, probably Svelte comes along and pushes it out of the way. But for the time being, you know, it's getting the job done for me, and it's getting it done in a way that, you know, if I don't have to use Redux and spend, you know, that 15, 20, 30 hours, you know, just writing, you know, actions and, you know, getting stuff into context and things like that, you know, this is a winner, you know.
Is anyone else on the call using React Query or has played around with it? Is anyone else using something else for their state management in React? Other than Redux or MobX or cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, what about ideas for topics for the next React meetup? Anyone want to give a talk or want to suggest some topics? All right. Well, I will put my thinking cap on. Feel free to hit me up. Next week, we'll be talking about Svelte and the new Svelte kit release. Do a quick demo of that. And then, you know, we'll have React. I think it'll be in May or probably the end of April, next React meetup. And look forward to seeing you guys next time. Thanks again, Scott. Awesome job. And I think React Query looks like a winner. So thanks again.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.